I was not a man who noticed things by the time the flowers began. That is what I would tell you if you asked me to account for the year, and Silas has, more than once, in the comfortable way old friends acquire the right to ask uncomfortable things. He will lean back in his chair by my fire and say, "Edmund, how is it that a man who commanded 300 cavalry at Velden could not identify a printer's daughter in a town of 400 souls for 12 consecutive months?" And I have no adequate answer. Only this: I was not in those days looking. My name is Edmund Ashworth. I am the Duke of Railford, a title that carries with it a stone house on the eastern edge of North Yorkshire, 1,100 acres of moorland, a damp and magnificent library, and in the year of which I write, a reputation for being the least sociable peer north of the Humber. The reputation was deserved. I had come home from the wars with a wound across my left eye that left me with half my sight and all of my pride intact, which is perhaps the worst possible ratio. My wife, Eleanor, had died in the February of my second year abroad, of fever, swift and complete, the letter reaching me 3 months after the fact, in a billeted farmhouse outside Calais. I had stood holding the paper in the November rain and felt something in my chest go quiet in a way that, for a very long time, did not come undone. I do not say these things to establish my suffering. A man who has seen war knows better than to rank his grief on any scale of merit. I say them only so that you understand the quality of my silence when I returned to Railford Hall in the late autumn of that first year. It was not dramatic. It was not even particularly sad, in the visible way sadness is supposed to look. I was simply absent. Present in the rooms of my own house, present at my own table, signing my own correspondence in my own hand, and absent from all of it. My housekeeper, Mrs. Thorne, managed the household with the serene competence of a woman who had worked for the Ashworths since before I was born, and she managed me with the same competence, which meant she left me largely to myself and appeared only when required. It was Mrs. Thorne who first brought the flower to my attention, though she did not know she was doing it. "There was a sprig of heather on the front step this morning," she said one November, setting my breakfast tray. "I have put it in the blue pitcher in the hall. I assumed you would not want it cluttering the step." I looked up from the letter I was reading. Heather. Yorkshire heather, fresh. Someone must have left it. She smoothed the tray cloth and did not elaborate. I returned to my letter. I assumed, as I said, that it was her own sentiment, some small October tradition she kept and felt no need to explain. Mrs. Thorne was that kind of woman, efficient, unexplained, occasionally touching. I said nothing. The next morning there was another sprig. And the morning after that. By the end of the first week, I was mildly aware that something was occurring on my front step, in the same distracted way one becomes aware that a clock is ticking after it has been ticking for some time. Mrs. Thorne continued to collect the sprigs and put them in the blue pitcher. The pitcher began to look like a corner of the moor had been transplanted to my hallway. I noticed this, noted it vaguely, and did not pursue it. In the third week, the sprig became a small bundle, 4 or 5 stems of heather, tied with a strip of pale ribbon. In the fourth week, a late Michaelmas rose appeared among the heather, dried at the edges but held carefully upright by the ribbon. It had been chosen with some thought. Someone, I realized, was paying attention to what was available on the moor in November, which is not much, and was making the most of it. I was sufficiently curious to say, that evening at supper, "Mrs. Thorne, the heather, do you know who leaves it?" She considered this for slightly longer than the question seemed to warrant. "I have a notion," she said, "but I wouldn't want to say in case I'm mistaken." "Who?" I said. "I believe it may be one of the Vane girls," she said, "the printer's daughters. From Coppice Lane, the eldest Cecily, but I am not certain." Why would a printer's daughter leave heather on my step? Mrs. Thorne looked at me with the expression she reserves for questions she considers to have obvious answers that she is too polite to voice. I couldn't say, "Your Grace." I let the matter rest. I had no idea who Cecily Vane was, and I was not in the habit of investigating the private motivations of people I had never met. If she wished to leave Heather on my step, I supposed she could leave Heather on my step. It was not harming anything. But I began, in spite of myself, to look at the bundles more carefully. December brought small dried sprigs of rosemary, wound with the heather, and once, I remember this distinctly, a single stem of something I did not recognize, pale silvered and faintly sweet-smelling, that Mrs. Thorne identified when I carried it to her, as meadowsweet dried from the summer. Someone kept it carefully, she said, turning it in her hands. To still look like this in December, it would have been pressed and dried in August. I stood with that information for a moment. August. The flowers had begun arriving in November. Someone had, in August, pressed a stem of meadowsweet and set it aside against the possibility of its being useful in a bundle for a man they had not yet begun leaving flowers for. I did not know what to make of this. I put it down and went back to my library. January was my worst month that year, as January had been my worst month every year since Eleanor's fever. There is something about the hard, flat light of January in North Yorkshire, the gray sky and the frozen ground and the absence of color, that strips away whatever moderate equilibrium one has managed to construct and leaves one simply in the cold. I moved through the house slowly that month. I did not open the correspondence that arrived. I ate little. Silas, who came up from London for a fortnight with the express purpose of annoying me back to life, sat with me in the library most evenings and talked without requiring me to respond, which was, I realize now, a form of love I was too frozen to acknowledge at the time. Through all of it, the flowers arrived. In January, they were simpler dried lavender, a sprig of winter greenery, once a small knot of twisted birch twigs arranged with an odd geometric precision that made it look almost sculptural. I found myself looking forward to them in the mornings in a way I could not entirely account for, not with eagerness, with something quieter than eagerness, a small, reliable certainty that the thing would be there, which was, in January, more than most things managed. Silas noticed. "You went to the front door this morning," he said, on the third day of his visit. He said it with studied neutrality, the way he says things when he is trying not to make something of them. "I did," I said. "Yourself, not Thorne." "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Edmund, are you going to the front door to collect a small bundle of greenery left by a girl from Coppice Lane?" "It is not, the point is not the greenery," I said, which was not much of a rebuttal. "What is the point?" I did not answer him. I was not sure I knew the answer. I knew only that the going to the door had begun sometime in mid-December, that I had, one morning, woken slightly earlier than usual and found myself, without having consciously decided to do so, pulling on my coat and stepping out into the cold before Mrs. Thorne had come down. The bundle had been there, as it always was. I had stood on the step and held it for a moment and felt, with some bewilderment, that this was a thing I could not remember feeling in a considerable while. The simple, bracing fact of the cold air on my face, the specific weight of a small living thing in my hands. I had gone back inside and thought about it, and decided to stop thinking about it, which had not entirely worked. "I don't know who she is," I told Silas that evening. "And you have not inquired further?" "Mrs. Thorne believes it is a Miss Cecily Vane, a printer's daughter." Silas looked at me for a long moment. "How long has she been leaving them?" "Since November." Another pause, and it is now January. "I am aware of the calendar, Silas." He said nothing, but the particular quality of his silence conveyed a great deal. The question he did not ask aloud, the question I had been avoiding, was, "What does she want?" Because in my experience, which was the experience of a duke with an estate and a title and a persistent reputation, people who did things in the general direction of a man of my station wanted something. Not always something cynical. Sometimes it was only visibility, only the wish to be seen by someone who mattered in the local geography of power. But there was always something. I did not think even then that Cecily Vane wanted anything. I had no evidence for this. I only had the meadowsweet dried in August, and the geometric precision of the birch twigs, and the way the bundles were placed. Not prominently, not in the center of the step so they could not be missed, but to one side, where they would not be stepped on but where a person could equally well have passed them without noticing them at all. They were not placed to demand attention. They were placed as if the person who left them was comfortable with the possibility that no one would notice. This was unusual. In my experience, people who wanted something arranged their gifts where they could not be missed. Silas left in early February and extracted from me, in exchange for his departure, a promise that I would ride into the village at least once a week. I kept this promise with minimal grace. Railford, the town, not the Hall, is a modest market town, handsome enough in its own greystone northern way, built along the deep cleft of a beck that runs fast over limestone and gives the main street a cold clarity of sound on quiet mornings. I had not spent much time there since my return. My various tenants and the local businesses managed their interactions with my estate through Mrs. Thorne and my steward, which suited us all. The town did not require me, and I had not required it. My first rides into the village were purely mechanical. I circled the market, noted that it was Tuesday, that there was a stall selling root vegetables and another selling bolts of wool, and went home. But gradually, across February and into March, I found myself lingering. I knew where Coppice Lane was. I did not deliberately ride down Coppice Lane. I am particular about this. But I did on occasion happen to pass the end of it, and I noted that there was a printer's establishment at number 4, a narrow-fronted building with a hand-painted sign reading Vane and Son, printers, and a small window display of sample handbills and a broadsheet or two. I saw no one. The shop was often open but occupied, as far as I could tell, by a stout man in his 50s who moved between the front counter and an inner room with the focused efficiency of a craftsman who does not look up from his work to see who is passing. He did not look up. I kept passing. In March, the bundles changed again. The dried winter things were replaced slowly by the first arrivals of spring snowdrop, windflower, early primrose, each one chosen carefully, I could see, to survive the laying and the collecting without too much damage. They were placed, as always, to one side of the step in the early morning, well before I rose. I began rising earlier. Still, I could not time it right. Whoever it was had a gift for earliness that surpassed mine, or a gift for invisibility, or both. It was April when I first saw her. I had woken at first light, the yellow spring light that comes in North Yorkshire in April around 5 in the morning, and dressed without calling anyone and gone to the front of the house. I did not go to the front door. I went instead to the window of the small east-facing room at the corner of the ground floor, which gave a narrow but direct line of sight down the gravel drive to the front gate. I had told myself I was going to the room for no particular reason. I had a particular reason. She was at the gate when I looked out. She had her back to me, already turning to leave. What I saw was a young woman in a gray wool dress and a darker gray cloak, with dark hair dressed practically under a plain bonnet, carrying a small wicker basket. She moved without hurry. She did not look back at the house. She pulled the gate closed behind her, carefully, so it did not clang, and walked back along the moor road toward the lane end with the quiet purposefulness of someone who has done a thing they are accustomed to doing. I stood at the window for what may have been a full minute after she was out of sight. She was not what I did not know what I had expected. I had not, I think, expected anything. But I had perhaps expected some flutter of self-consciousness in her movement, some sideways glance at the house, some sign that she was aware of being observed or hoped to be. There was none of that. She had set the bundle down, closed the gate, and walked away as though the thing were entirely between herself and the morning, with no audience required or desired. I went back to the hall. I picked up the bundle, cowslip and late windflower, bound with pale ribbon, and I held it for a rather longer time than was strictly necessary. April became May. I rode into the village more often now. I told myself it was Silas's instruction, which it no longer really was. It had been 3 months since his instruction, and I had long since fulfilled it in the purely numerical sense. The real reason was something I had not yet learned to name. I rode past Coppice Lane with more frequency. I began to notice the print shop's hours. I began, in a small and mortifying way, to pay attention. I saw her for the second time on a Tuesday market morning in late May. She was at the stall that sold ribbon and thread, a narrow trestle near the market cross, holding 2 ribbons up to the light, and considering them with the serious attention most people reserve for rather more significant decisions. She was in the same gray dress or one very like it, with a basket over her arm and her bonnet tied against the wind. She was not beautiful, by which I mean she did not have the formal arrangement of features that the word is usually applied to. She had an expressive face, quick-eyed, attentive, the kind of face that reacts to things without entirely intending to, and she moved through the market with a specific self-containment that was quite different from shyness. She was not shy. She was private. There is a difference. Shyness is afraid of being seen. What she had was more like a preference for directing her attention outward, toward the world, rather than spending it on her own visibility. I rode on. I did not stop. But I thought about the ribbons she had been considering. The pale ribbon on the bundles, it had always been pale, faintly cream or white, the same throughout the year. It had come from somewhere. I wondered, in a way I found faintly ridiculous, whether she purchased the ribbon specifically, or whether it was ribbon left over from something else, repurposed with the economical ingenuity of a printer's household. I should say something about the quality of this wondering. It was not, in those spring months, dramatic. I want to be precise here, I had been dormant for 2 years. I had been present in my life in the way a piece of furniture is present in a room, occupying space, fulfilling technical function, and inspiring in no one any particular feeling. The wondering about Cecily Vane was the first sign I had that I was, in some deeply reluctant and unwilling way, beginning to be present again in the actual sense, noticing a person, thinking about them, finding that the thought continued past the initial observation, instead of dissolving immediately, as all thoughts had dissolved for 2 years. This frightened me a little, not the person, I still barely knew her. The waking up frightened me. I had grown accustomed to the quiet. The quiet was manageable. The waking up meant things would be felt again. I said nothing to Silas in his letters. He would have been insufferable. It was in June that I began to follow her. I use that word plainly, because Silas has used it before me and I am no longer embarrassed by the plainness of it. I had caught sight, one morning, of her turning off the moor road onto the track that ran along the top of Railford Beck, and I had, without any formal decision, turned my horse and followed at a distance sufficient not to be conspicuous. She was walking quickly, with her basket, in the direction of the high meadow where the summer flowers came in. I followed her to the edge of the track, stopped, watched her cross the meadow to the far hedge where I knew the wild roses grew early against the stone, and watched her select and cut a few stems with a small knife from her basket. Then she came back across the meadow, and I was sufficiently caught out that I simply stayed where I was and let her see me. She stopped at the edge of the meadow and looked at me without embarrassment. I had my hat in my hand, I do not know why. "Good morning," I said. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was clear and level. She looked at me with the same attentiveness she had directed at the ribbons in the market, as though I were something worth considering accurately. I could not think of a single thing to say after that. This was not a difficulty I was accustomed to. I am, or had been, a man of moderate social facility. The army and the peerage both require a certain ability to conduct oneself in conversation, and I had managed it without much effort for most of my adult life. But I stood there on the track with my hat in my hand, and nothing in my head. She waited a moment. Then she said, "You will excuse me, Your Grace," and walked past me back toward the lane. I rode home. I felt like a very particular kind of fool, the kind that has the intelligence to understand precisely how foolish they are being, which is, I have found, the worst kind. The bundle the next morning was wild rose, bound with pale ribbon, as always placed to the left of the step where it would not be stepped on. I began to be more deliberate. In July I started rising at 4:30, which in North Yorkshire in July means rising in full light. I dressed without calling Jinx, went downstairs quietly, and went to the east room window. I was not always in time. On most mornings she had already been and gone. The bundle was on the step and the gate was latched and the moor road was empty. But twice in July I was there in time to watch her at the gate, and once, the third time, at the end of July, the morning before the day I finally did the thing I should have done in February. I went to the front door and opened it while she was still at the gate. She turned. She did not startle. She looked at me across the gravel, perhaps 30 feet, with the same steady attentiveness, the bundle in her hands not yet placed. I should have spoken. Instead, I stood in my own doorway and looked at her and said nothing, and after a moment she set the bundle down very carefully on the gate post, not on the step, because she was still at the gate, and turned and walked away. I went and collected it from the gate post. Meadowsweet again. It was July. The fresh meadowsweet was in. She had remembered, apparently, that she had used the dried variety in January. I stood on the moor road holding the meadowsweet and felt the particular complex embarrassment of a man who has squandered 3 opportunities through sheer inability to begin a sentence, and told myself, very plainly, that this would have to stop. The next morning I was at the gate before she arrived. This had required calculation. I had noted, over the preceding weeks, that she came between 5 and 5:15. The window varied by about 15 minutes, presumably depending on how early she herself rose or how long it took her to walk from Coppice Lane. I was at the gate at 10 minutes before 5, which meant I had stood there for a somewhat excessive 22 minutes before she came around the bend in the moor road and stopped. She was carrying the basket. She looked at me standing at my own gate in the very early morning with an expression that was not, I thought, entirely surprised. "Miss Vane," I said. "Your Grace," she said. A pause of moderate length elapsed during which I was aware that I had engineered this moment with significant effort, and was now responsible for it. "I wanted to thank you," I said, "for the flowers, for the year of them." She considered this. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "I didn't leave them to be thanked." "I know," I said. "That is why I am thanking you." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, not quite surprise, something that came and went too quickly to name. "May I ask why you did it?" I said. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it was in the way she did everything, without hedging, without performance, without apparent concern for how the answer would be received. "I pass this way every morning when I go to the high meadow for whatever is in season. I started noticing the house, the state of it, I suppose. The gates always closed, no one coming or going. Mrs. Thorne tells me more than she thinks she does when I see her in the market." She paused. "I thought someone should leave something at the gate, that is all." "Someone should leave something at the gate," I repeated. "Yes. For no particular reason." "For no particular reason that I expected to explain," she said, which was subtly different. I looked at her. She looked back. The morning was perfectly clear, the sky the particular pale gold of a Yorkshire summer at 5 in the morning, the beck audible below the road, the heather on the upper moor just beginning its summer color. "Miss Vane," I said, "would you walk with me a moment?" She looked at the basket. She looked at the direction of the high meadow. She looked at me. "I have flowers to collect," she said. "Then I will walk with you while you collect them," I said, "if you don't object." She did not say she did not object. She simply turned back toward the high meadow track, and I fell into step beside her. We walked in silence for some time. This is the thing I remember most clearly from that morning, not the words, though the words came, but the walk itself. The specific quality of walking beside another person after 2 years of walking alone. The adjustment of pace, she walked quickly, as I had observed from a distance, and I matched her without difficulty. The sound of 2 sets of boots on the track. The fact of another person's proximity in the open air, in the morning, in the ordinary and unremarkable way of 2 people going somewhere together. "You were at Veldon," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. My brother was at Veldon. He came home in the first batch of wounded, his left arm." She did not say it as an overture to sympathy or as a bid for connection. She said it the way she said everything, as accurate information. "Is he well?" "Better than he was. He works in the shop still." She glanced at me, not at my eye, at my face. "You came home later." "I did." She did not pursue it. This was, I realized, characteristic of her. She did not pursue things. She made space for them to exist without crowding them. We reached the high meadow. She went directly to the far hedge and set down her basket and began to move along the stone wall where the flowers grew thickest, cutting with the small knife and making her selections with the serious efficiency I had observed from the track in June. I stood at the edge of the meadow and watched her. "You can help if you want," she said without looking up. I had not in my adult life gathered wildflowers. I said this. "There's nothing to it," she said. "Don't take the ones that are past their best, and don't cut too close to the ground." I walked to the hedge and did as she said. We worked along the wall for perhaps a quarter of an hour in near silence. She would say occasionally the name of a thing, sweet briar, or make some observation. "The meadowsweet is early this year. We had a wet June," without expecting me to respond in any particular way. When the basket was full enough to satisfy her, she stood and surveyed it for a moment. "This will do," she said. Then, without any particular change of tone, "Did they help, the flowers?" I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," I said. "I think they did. I did not understand why at the time." "You don't have to understand a thing for it to help," she said. "No," I said, "you don't." She picked up the basket. She looked at me across the morning with those quick, accurate eyes. "Your eye," she said. "Does it give you trouble still?" No one had asked me this. Not Sela's, not Mrs. Thorne, not any of the half-dozen well-meaning neighbors who had called in the first weeks of my return, and whom I had driven off with sufficient disinterest that they had not returned. No one had asked because I had made it plain, through my manner, that the subject was not open. She asked it in the same level tone as everything else, as though she had simply noticed it was a fact worth inquiring about. "It gives me headaches," I said, "when I am tired." "My brother has them too," she said. "He says ginger and clove in hot water. I don't know if it works. He says it does." "I'll try it," I said. We walked back across the meadow together and down the track to the moor road. At the gate she stopped. "Thank you for walking with me," she said. "Thank you," I said, "for a year of flowers." She looked at me steadily. "You're welcome," she said, and then she turned and went back toward Coppice Lane. I stood at my own gate for a moment in the early morning and felt, with some clarity, the difference between the man who had stood here 2 years ago and the man who was standing here now. Not a dramatic difference, not a cured man, not a transformed man. Simply a man who had, gradually and without entirely meaning to, been brought back to the condition of noticing things. The sky, the beck, the particular weight of a basket of cut flowers. Another person's voice asking a plain question. I went inside. I told Mrs. Thorne I would be riding into the village after breakfast. She said, "Very good, Your Grace," and did not look up from the jam she was making. I rode into the village after breakfast. I went to Coppice Lane. The print shop was open. The stout man at the counter looked up when I came in, looked up, and then went very still in the way people go still when someone they were not expecting enters the room. "Your Grace," he said. He was Mr. Vane. This was immediately clear from the resemblance and from the expression, which was the expression of a man doing extremely rapid mental calculations about what a duke's unannounced appearance in his print shop could possibly mean. "Mr. Vane," I said, "I have come on a matter of some business. I need to commission a set of estate notices for the autumn, boundary notices, tenancy renewals, the usual. I was told you do excellent work." This was true. Mrs. Thorne had told me so, and she was reliable about such things. He relaxed fractionally. "We do, Your Grace. I can show you samples." He showed me samples. I examined them with genuine attention. They were very good, clean, and precise, the kind of work that takes real knowledge of the press and pride in the result. We discussed quantities and timing. He took notes. His son, a young man with a left arm held at a careful angle, came through from the back room twice, looking at me with the frank curiosity of someone who has spent time in army camps and learned not to be particularly intimidated by rank. Cecily did not appear. I had not expected her to. It was a working morning and she had been out since before 5 and likely had other work to attend to. I completed my business with her father, shook his hand, and left. I came back 3 weeks later to collect the proofs. She was at the counter. She looked up when I came in, not with the stillness her father had had, but with a brief, quiet recognition, as though she had noted the fact of my entering and filed it accurately. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Vane," I said, "the proofs." She brought them out from the back. We stood at the counter and I looked at them. They were exactly right. I said so. "My father will be pleased," she said. She was noting something in a ledger as she spoke. Her handwriting, I could see from the angle, was very small and very clear. "Tell me," I said, "is the Meadowsweet still in?" She looked up, a pause the kind that is assessing something. "Another week or 2, she said. "After that it will go to seed." "And then what comes?" "Ling Heather," she said. "We're coming back to where we started." We looked at each other across the counter. The morning light came in through the small window and lay across the ledger and her hand still holding the pen. "Miss Vane," I said, "I wonder if I might call on your father on Saturday." She said, "I will tell him." She told him. I called on Saturday. I sat in the front room of number 4, Coppice Lane, which was small and very clean and smelled of ink and the dried herbs that hung from the low ceiling, and I drank tea with Gerald Vane and his son Thomas, and talked about the press, and about the changes in Railford over the past decade and about the summer. Cecily came in with a second pot of tea and sat down without being asked to leave, which told me something about the household. Her father looked between us once, with the same rapid calculation expression as before, and then visibly decided not to make anything of it, which told me something about him. I called again the following Saturday, and the one after that. Silas came back to Railford Hall in October. He walked into the library on the evening of his first day, and looked at me sitting at my desk in the lamplight with a letter half-written before me, and he said, "You look different." "Do I?" "Less like a memorial to yourself," he said, which was, I thought, rather pointed. I told him about Cecily. Not all of it. Silas has a gift for extracting narrative with insufficient prompting and embroidering it at leisure, but the essential shape of it, the flowers, the year of them, the morning at the gate and the walk across the meadow and the calling at Coppice Lane. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then he said, "Edmund, she left flowers on your gate every morning for a year, and never once asked you for anything." "That is accurate." "And you didn't go to the gate yourself until August." "Also accurate." "You," he said, "are the most exasperating man I have ever had the misfortune to hold in considerable regard." I did not dispute this. He came with me to Coppice Lane the following Saturday. He was on his best behavior, which with Silas means he was only marginally intrusive, and he sat in the front room with Mr. Vane, and talked about London theatre while I sat at the far end of the room with Cecily, and the pot of autumn flowers she was making up for the windowsill ling heather, as she had predicted, and the last of the late rose, and some twigs of rowan with berries still on. "Does he know about the flowers?" she asked, quietly enough that it did not carry to the other end of the room. "He knows something," I said. "He will have worked out the rest." She arranged a stem of heather and did not look up. "Are you embarrassed about it?" "I thought about this. I said. "I'm less so now." She looked up at that. She looked at me for a moment with those clear, assessing eyes, and whatever it was she saw in my face appeared to satisfy her, because she returned to the heather and said nothing further on the subject. The November Saturday was cold. I arrived at Coppice Lane at the usual time and was shown into the front room by Thomas, who had adopted, over the preceding weeks, a manner of entirely unconvincing neutrality. Mr. Vane was printing in the back room. Thomas went to fetch him. The front room was empty. A small fire had been laid. Cecily came in from the kitchen with a plate of something and set it on the table. She looked at me. "My father is printing," she said. "He'll be another few minutes." "That's all right," I said. We stood in the small room in the early November cold with the new fire and the ink smell and the herbs overhead. She set the plate down and turned, and we were perhaps 6 feet apart, which in that room was not a great distance. I said, "Miss Vane, I should tell you something." She waited. "I have been thinking since August about how to say this properly. I don't believe I have managed it." A pause. "I was not well when you began leaving the flowers. Not in any visible sense I was functioning. But I was not here, not in the way a person is supposed to be here. I had been away, and I don't know when I would have come back or whether I would have come back entirely. I believe the flowers were, in some sense, the difference." She was listening. She did not speak. "I'm not saying this to burden you with it," I said, "or to make you responsible for something you did without any such intent. I am saying it because I think you should know that it mattered, that you mattered, long before I had the wit to come to my own gate." The fire crackled. The press could be heard faintly from the back of the house. She said, "I know you were not well. That was why I started." "Yes," I said, "I understand that now. I didn't for a long time." She looked at me steadily. "Are you well now?" "Better," I said, "considerably better, and getting better, which is perhaps more to the point." She nodded slowly, as though she were making a careful internal note. "Miss Vane," I said, "Cecily, I would like, if your father has no objection, and if you do not, I would like to court you properly. I am aware that I am a duke and you are a printer's daughter, and I am also aware that none of that is remotely the point. The point is that you are the most quietly remarkable person I have encountered in a very long time, and I have been trying to find a way to tell you so since the morning at the gate in August when I stood in my own doorway and said nothing at all." Something moved through her face, not amusement quite, but something close to it. "You were very silent," she agreed. "I was. I apologize for the silence." "I didn't mind the silence," she said. "I'm not frightened of silences." "I know," I said. "That is one of the things." She stood for a moment looking at me. The small room, the fire, the herbs overhead, the smell of ink. Then she said, "My father won't object. I can tell you that now." "And you?" A pause. "I don't object either," she said. Which was, from Cecily Vane, a great deal. Mr. Vane appeared in the doorway at that moment, wiping his hands on his apron, and looked between us with the expression of a man arriving at a scene whose significant moment has just passed. "Vane," I said, "I should like to speak with you." He sat down. We spoke. The winter was very different from the previous one. I will not pretend it was uncomplicated. Courtship, for a man of my habits of solitude, was a thing I had to relearn in some considerable detail, and Cecily was not a woman who made easy what she thought ought to require effort. There were evenings at Coppice Lane, and walks on the moor road on the days when the weather allowed, and 2 dinners at Railford Hall to which I invited the Vanes and which Silas, still in the county, attended with visible satisfaction. Cecily moved through Railford Hall with the same attentiveness she directed at everything, looking at things squarely, noting what she found, making no performance of being impressed or unimpressed. "It's a very large house," she said on the second dinner. We were standing in the library after supper, looking at the shelves. "It is," I said. "The east room needs replastering," she said. "There's a crack along the cornice on the north wall." "I know," I said. "I have been meaning to see to it." She nodded, as though this was satisfactory information, and turned back to the shelves. I proposed to her on a Sunday in January, in the library in the morning, because it is the room I am most myself in, and I thought it was appropriate to be most myself for this particular question. She sat in the chair across from my desk, and I sat in mine, and we had been talking about something entirely else. The question of a new press Mr. Vane was considering, whether it was the right time for the investment, and I stopped in the middle of the conversation and said, "Cecily, will you marry me?" It was not elegantly done. There was no ceremony to it. She looked at me for a moment with those precise, accurate eyes, and then she said, "Yes, I will." We sat for a moment with that between us. Then she said, "About the press, I think it is the right time." "I think so too," I said. We married in April, a small ceremony at the Railford Parish Church, which was perfectly adequate for the purpose, and which had the advantage of being the church whose graveyard I passed every morning on my early ride, and whose rector was a decent man who kept the service to an appropriate length. Silas stood with me. Thomas Vane stood with Cecily. Mr. Vane wept quietly throughout. Mrs. Thorne did not weep, but her expression, when she greeted us at the hall afterwards, conveyed a depth of satisfaction that I found affecting. Cecily moved into Railford Hall in late April. The East Room's cornice was seen to within the first 2 weeks. The library gained several volumes from the Coppice Lane house that turned out, on examination, to be considerably more interesting than their battered covers suggested. Cecily acquired an opinion about the garden that was substantially more decisive than my own, and the garden improved accordingly. There is not much more to tell in the sense of events. The year after our marriage was the first year in which I did not dread January. This seems, on the surface, like a small thing. I have come to think it is not a small thing at all. I should say one more thing, because Silas will ask me about it eventually, and I would rather say it myself. On the first morning of our second winter together, a cold November, clear and bright, I woke before her and dressed quietly and went downstairs. I went to the kitchen, where Mrs. Thorne keeps the jars she collects the cut flowers in, and I found a small jar. Then I went out to the moor, up the track past the gate, onto the high ground where the ling heather was at its last color before the winter came down. I cut a small bundle, not much, just a handful of heather and a few stalks of dried meadowsweet that had gone to seed but still held their shape. I came back down the moor road. I went to the front step. I set the bundle down to the left of the step where it would not be trodden on. Then I stood at my own gate for a moment in the November morning and felt, very precisely, the thing I had not been able to feel in the first year of the flowers. The thing she had felt every morning, I think, when she set her bundle down and turned without looking up at the windows. The simple, sufficient pleasure of giving something with no expectation of acknowledgement, of leaving something at a door because it seemed to you that someone should. She found it when she came down. I heard her in the hall, the particular quality of her footsteps, which I had learned over the months the way one learns another person's particular quality of silence, and then I heard her open the front door. I did not go to the hall. I stayed in the library with my letters. After a moment I heard her come in. She appeared in the library doorway and looked at me. She was holding the bundle. "You went to the moor," she said. "I did," I said. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at me with those clear, accurate eyes. Then she said, "Thank you." You don't have to thank me, I said. I didn't leave it to be thanked. And the corner of her mouth moved, the particular, small movement I had learned to read as the thing that came before a smile, in a woman who did not perform her feelings but felt them plainly and entirely, and let them show only when they were genuinely there. I know, she said, that is why I am. A year of flowers, and not one of them left to be thanked. But on that morning, in the library, with the heather in her hands and the November light on the floor between us, I thought, there are worse things in the world than a woman who understands the precise weight of the gift you are trying to give her. There are far, far worse things than being seen,